Good morning, church family. We invite you to sing with us, page 431, Over Yonder. 431.
All three verses?
Come, let us sing of homeland, down by the crystal sea, wonderful land where Jesus buildeth a mansion for me. Over yonder, down by the crystal sea, over yonder, there's where I long to be. No more sorrow, toil, grief, nor care, in that homeland bright and fair. Over there, water of life there floweth, fruit in abundant store. Citizens of that country, hunger and thirst nevermore. Over yonder, down by the crystal sea, over yonder, there's where I long to be. No more sorrow, toil, grief, nor care, in that homeland bright and fair. Over there. Come, go with me to homeland. Jesus invites you there. Help spread the invitation. Tell it to men everywhere. Over yonder, down by the crystal sea. Over yonder, there's where I long to be. No more sorrow, toil, grief, nor care, in that homeland bright and fair. Over there. And page 508, Anywhere with Jesus. Boy, is that true today. We shouldn't go anywhere without him.
Amen.
Page 508. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Anywhere he leads me in this world below. Anywhere without him dearest joys would fade. Anywhere with Jesus I am not afraid. Anywhere, anywhere, fear I cannot know. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Anywhere with Jesus I am not alone. Other friends may fail me, he is still my own. Though his hand may lead me over dreary ways, anywhere with Jesus is a and go to sleep. When the gloomy shadows round about me creep, knowing I shall waken nevermore to roam. Anywhere with Jesus we'll be home, sweet home. Anywhere, anywhere, fear I cannot know. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Amen, and thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. We want to welcome you to our Sabbath worship service here at North Valley. We hope that as we worship together, you will receive a blessing from the Lord. We want to also welcome our visitors today. We have a number of visitors. We're glad you chose to come and join us for worship service today. We do have a fellowship meal after our worship service, and all are invited to attend. Our call to worship this morning is from 2 Corinthians. Is it up on the screen? 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 18, I believe it is. I'm saying it from memory because I can't read it, so bear with me. And I will be a father to you, and you shall be my sons and daughters, saith the Lord, the Almighty. And continuing with the next verse, chapter 7 and verse 1. Therefore, having these promises, dearly beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. Let's kneel wherever possible, and we'll have prayer. And I would like to have one of the portable mics, if I could. Can I have one of the portable? Oh, sorry. Does it work? Okay. All right. Let's pray. Our kind, loving Father in heaven, we are so grateful, Lord, for the privilege of coming together in your house of prayer. We thank you, Lord, for keeping us safely during this past week. We thank you for the opportunities to witness to your power and grace in the lives of others. And now, Lord, as we assemble before you, we humble our hearts. We ask that you would forgive us of our sins, that you would cleanse our hearts and minds from all unrighteousness. And Lord, we want to remember those who have been mentioned today who are in need of healing. We bring them to you, Lord, and pray that you would remember your word, your promise, that the Son of Righteousness would arise upon us with healing in his wings. Remember also, Lord, your promise to Israel of old. I am the Lord, your healer. We pray that you would heal us in body and in mind and in spirit. We pray that as we worship you today, Lord, that we might worship you in spirit and in truth. Remember those, Lord, who could not be here today. I pray that you would give them a Sabbath day's blessing, just as you are blessing us. Thank you for bringing Brother Hill Lord from the Oregon Conference to speak with us today. We pray that your spirit of wisdom and revelation would rest upon him as he brings us your word. We pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
We invite you to stand for our opening song, and you have to sing loud because the brass is going to play with us. Page 470, There's Sunshine in My Soul. Is there sunshine in your soul today? Amen. Amen. There is sunshine in my soul today, more glorious and bright than glows in any earthly sky. For Jesus is mine.
Our special music today is brought to us by the God of Grace, our rejoicing band, our guest musicians today. Thank you for coming to be with us. I have asked Amy to help me this morning. Our scripture reading is from Colossians chapter 3. What verses, Amy?
13 and 14. 13 and 14.
All right, would you read for us?
Bearing with one another and forgiving one another, if anyone has a complaint against another, even as Christ forgave you, so you also must do. But above all these things, put on love, which is the bond of perfection.
All right. Thank you, Amy. But above all, put on love, which is the bond of perfection. Perfect love, which casts out all fear. Well, the time has come for us to introduce Pastor Randy Hill. Did I get it right? You got it right. Pastor Randy Hill is from the Oregon Conference, and we so appreciate that he's going to be sharing God's Word with us today. Pastor Hill.
Good morning, church. If I may, before we open our Bibles and get into our passage for today, would you indulge me with a few preliminaries? If you would, I would appreciate it. So today's a special day. around Southern Oregon. I think there's 12 churches that folks like myself from the office have fanned out to take the pulpit and give the pastors a day off. Your pastor, I don't know that it ends up because he has more than one church, and I don't know that we covered all of his churches, so he may be preaching today. But the intent was good, right? I don't know that we have enough folks in the conference office to cover all the churches, but those of us who were available to come down. And so I got to be in your church. And it's unique for me because I served at the Medford Church for 11 and a half years. And during that whole time period, I don't think I ever made it into this building. I knew the church was here, over there in Merlin. There's a group of people. But I don't know that I ever made it over here. And I am impressed with your facility, with your congregation. And it's just an honor to be with you this morning. So I'm in the conference office now after having been in Medford for that period of time. I moved from Medford to be in the youth department at the conference office. I was the Pathfinder director and associate youth director for the conference, and I did that for a little over 7 years. And then a year ago, they looked at the color of my hair, and they said, "Youth department, gray hair. How does that work?" Actually, it was me that did that, and no one in the office, but I said, maybe it's time for a transition. I felt like maybe I was in the way of a young leader. And so I said, if you've got something else for me, let's begin that conversation. And a year ago, I transitioned out of the youth department, and I'm now the assistant to the president. That's a wonderful title. What it means is when a church is without a pastor because they've moved, I get the joy of going through the process of helping them find their next pastor. So I get to do that. And then there's this little thing that happens every summer in July at Gladstone called camp meeting. And they've asked me to kind of be the point person for camp meeting. So each of the teams that have a different function, I meet with them and make sure that the wheels of the institution continue to grind away so that we have the campus ready and the programming ready for camp meeting to happen. And then they've given me a couple of other things that I get to do. Have you ever worked in a job where it says other duties as assigned? So I get to do that. So I'm the other duties as assigned guy. And if you have been reading the e-communique that comes out from the conference office, you are aware that that wonderful tent that they put up for camp meeting, we ran into some struggles last year. Only to find out that the rental companies that we deal with to get that put up and taken down each year have really struggled since COVID. And we have had to cobble together a team just to put up the tent for this year. And we found some companies that could come and handle it, but they're from far away, they're not local, and the expense was so high to continue using a tent that we will begin construction of an actual building to take the tent's place after camp meeting this year. And so I get to be the point person for trying to make sure the construction aspect happens. So that's one of those other duties as assigned. So that's it. Why are we here? Why are we doing what we're doing? You may be aware that the conference has to have these town halls by our bylaws. We are supposed to, as a conference, come around to the different regions of the conference and give a kind of a State of the Union report and give churches an opportunity to talk with the officers, the president and the vice president and those folks of the conference, give you an opportunity to share and ask questions. And we have noticed that while we are required to do that, no one is required to attend. Right? Is that a good way of saying it? And so in an effort to help all of us, we decided we would do it this way this year. I'm here, and I will present with you, and I will extend the invitation personally for you to go to the Medford Church this afternoon at 4:30 for that meeting. And it will be a time of worship. It will be a time of reports, and it will be a time where you can ask questions of the president of the conference and interact in that fashion. And so it's an invitation. But it's more than that. It is so easy. I'm a prime example. 11 and a half years in Medford and never had been in this building. It's so easy for us to forget that we belong to a sisterhood of churches and interact with people who worship just like we do every Sabbath and get to know them. And it's an opportunity for that. It's an opportunity for you to get to know folks from the other churches in Southern Oregon. And so I want to invite you to do that. Is that a good enough little rah-rah invitation? So that's part of why I'm here. I really enjoy my job. I get to be in a different conference church almost every weekend. And that has been very eye-opening for me. Have you ever, you've all visited a church maybe once or twice? And maybe if you've visited long enough, you discover that there's some pretty amazing people in churches around Oregon and Southern Washington. And I think that's the thing that has impressed me the most. As I've worked with churches and attended churches, I find people who are dedicated, who just give and give and give to make their church a welcoming, warm place. And I enjoy that very much, just getting to know our conference. We are a wide variety of opinions about things, and yet we all still call ourselves Seventh-day Adventists. And that's a neat thing to experience. And I don't recommend that you leave here to go do what I'm doing because you're needed here. But it's just neat to get to know everybody. I have a little speech that I give when I'm new in a church, and if you'll indulge me for just that moment. And my speech goes like this. If you are a visitor here today, your radar is on. You're checking this place out. You're thinking, maybe I'll attend here. Maybe these are people I will like. And you're evaluating. And I just want you to know that the next 30 or so minutes that we're going to spend together, I take very seriously. I think the preaching, I think you would call it the preaching hour, but it's not. I won't go that long, I promise. But the preaching event is something that is unique. We are people who like to interact. We like to share our opinions. We like to give our thoughts and all of that. And then all of a sudden we come to this moment in the week where we stop and we sit and we listen. And the desire of that is that God would speak despite the person who's the one speaking, right? And I hold that very sacred. If you're a visitor here today and for whatever reason this guy doesn't agree with you, I'm not your style, please come back next week and the week after that. The people who know this congregation, they will be here. I'm a visitor here just like you, right? So you can discount me to a certain extent. Come back and get to know these people. I think you'll find that they're a special group of people. Now, if you're a member here and you don't like what's about to happen, you got to come back next week anyway, right? But I do pray that the time will be beneficial. So there's that little speech. I also want to say thank you to the brass this morning. I thought it was terrific. I had a father who was a trombone player, and I used to listen to him practice as a kid. And your director has a special place in my heart because she was the director of my children when we were in Medford. And so, Kathy, thank you for doing what you do. I'm not surprised to find you here. Music is your ministry, and it's evident. And so thank you. Okay. Can we have a quick prayer before we launch into it? Father in heaven, we pause just now, and we ask that you would just remove from our eyes anything that would hinder our ability to hear you speak through the word this morning. We thank you for the opportunity to pause and be here. I ask a blessing upon this congregation and upon our time, and I ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, here we go. One of my preaching heroes approached some verses in the same fashion, and that approach has never ceased to amaze me, and so I mimic him to the best of my ability whenever I get the chance. I want to do something dangerous with you this morning. I want to invite you to do something in church today that probably no other pastor has asked of you, and maybe for good reason, because sitting and listening is hard for us, and many of us, when we sit and listen, can get a little bit drowsy. And I'm going to ask you to close your eyes. And you can picture the scenes that I'm going to describe, because I'm going to ask you to use your imagination quite a bit this morning. And if you can use your mind's eye as we go through it, we will take some liberality with our imaginations this morning. Please recognize I want to be true to the text, but I also want to invite you to picture what's happening in the text with your imagination. So I'm going to ask you, if you feel free to close your eyes. Now, if you do fall asleep, I can handle it. I won't be offended. I'll be the only one. I'll ask everybody else to just keep eyes forward. But if you start snoring, that's on you. All right? I would like to read a passage of Scripture for you, at least most of it, not completely, and it's found in Romans chapter 16. Romans chapter 16, and it reads in part like this. I would like you to welcome our sister Phoebe. Greet Priscilla and Aquila. They work together with me in serving Christ Jesus. Greet also the church that meets in the house of Priscilla and Aquila. Greet my dear friend Epaenetus. Greet Mary. She worked hard for you. Greet Andronicus and Junius, my fellow Jews. Greet Ampliatus, my dear friend in the Lord. Greet Urbanus. He works together with me in serving Christ. And greet my dear friend Stachys. Greet Apelles. Greet those who live in the house of Aristobulus. Greet Herodion, my fellow Jew. Greet the believers who live in the house of Narcissus. Greet Tryphena and Tryphosa. Greet my dear friend Persis. Greet Rufus. He's a chosen believer in the Lord. And greet his mother. Greet Syncritus, Phlegon, and Hermes. Greet Petrobus, Hermas. We had Hermes, now this is Hermas. And the other brothers and sisters with them. Greet Philologus, Julia, Nereus, and his sister. Greet Olympus and all of the Lord's people who are with them. Greet one another with a holy kiss. All the churches of Christ send their greetings. That was most of Romans chapter 16, verses 1 through 16. Didn't that just excite you? There are some passages that we, when we're reading, just kind of flip the page, aren't there? They just don't, we blow right by them. They don't capture our imaginations much. And we can even feel a little bit guilty, just kind of skipping by. You get to Chronicles, and it's really easy to just skip by and get to the good stuff, right? The so-and-so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. That'll just drive you numb. This passage can be that way. It's not very interesting. It's a list of strange-sounding names that we can hardly pronounce. Here it seems like Paul is calling the roll of a church, right? Which is kind of a strange thing in itself. I've never been a part of a church that called the roll each week. Can you imagine? Can you imagine what, if instead of announcements in church, somebody stood up here with a clipboard with a check, and they would call out your name to see if you were in church this week? Boy, you wouldn't want to skip, I'd think. I mean, everybody would know it. It's hard enough if you sit in the same spot every week. right? People know when you're not around. But you wouldn't want to skip. And then there would be the rebellious among us who would go ahead and skip just to start a little bit of a scandal, right? Now, I pastored the Medford Church, and when I first arrived there, a lady had just passed away who everybody just loved dearly, and she knew where everybody sat in church. And during the praise time and the announcement time, she would walk up and down the center aisle, and she would write down lists of names of families that weren't in church that week. And then she would send a bulletin and a "We missed you" card. And I don't think I ever heard anybody talk about that negatively. It was always very positive, that they loved that she did that they had somebody who recognized when they weren't there and took the time to make sure that they still felt like they were part of the group. And they loved it. And I just never heard anybody talk about it negatively. But in this day and age, I could hear people joking. It's a husband talking to a wife at Sabbath morning. "Are we going to church today? Oh, let's just watch it," right? We can do that now. We can just watch it. Let's just watch it. "Oh, no, we better get up. If we don't, we're going to get one of those notes," right? It's like they took the roll each week. Sometimes calling the roll is not all that boring. Do you ever attend a really large class in school where the teacher took the roll? Right? Attendance was required, and some kids would skip out of class, and their friends would try to cover for them, right? So the teacher's looking down at her grade book, and she's calling kids' names out, and somebody would yell "here" for their friend, right? But invariably, 2 or 3 friends would yell out "here" at the same time, and the teacher would look up with that over-the-glasses kind of a look, right? Just giving okay, they're not here, don't you be doing that kind of a thing. And then it turned into something fun after that, because the teacher would call out, "Martha, is Martha here?" And some big hunk of a guy would go, "Here." The whole class would be laughing. I read an article not long ago. It was written way back in the late 60s, early 70s, where a guy was talking about a situation where the roll was taken. Back in the day, apparently, when you were summoned for jury duty, you were summoned by name. Now you're summoned by number, right? But back then it was by name. And in fact, this just applies to what we're saying so well. I want to read to you part of that article because it just fits, part of his experience. It reads like this. "Last December," he says, "I was summoned to Superior Court to serve on the jury. On Monday morning at 9 o'clock, 240 of us formed a pool out of which the jurors for civil and criminal cases would be chosen. The deputy clerk of the Superior Court stood and called all 240 names, and she did not have them in alphabetical order, so you had to really listen. There were 2 Bill Johnsons, and there was some confusion as to which one was which. There was a man named Clark who answered when the clerk read, 'Mrs. Clark,' and he said, 'Here.' She looked up and she said, 'Mrs. Clark?' 'Here.' 'Mrs. Clark.' And then he stood up and he said, 'Well, I thought the letter was for me, and I opened it.' The clerk said, 'We summoned Mrs. Clark.' 'Well,' he said, 'I'm here. Can I just do it? She doesn't have any interest in this kind of thing.' The clerk said, 'Mr. Clark, how do you know? She doesn't even know she's been summoned.' There was a man whose name I wrote down phonetically because I couldn't spell it. His name was Zerfel Leichenstein. I remember it because they went over it 5 or 6 times, mispronouncing it each time. He insisted that his name be pronounced correctly, and he finally stood up in a huff and said, 'I see no reason why I should serve on a jury in a court that can't pronounce my name.' The woman sitting next to me said, 'Leichenstein? I wonder if he's a Jew.' I said, 'Well, I don't know. Could be. Does it matter?' 'I'm German. My name is Zeller.' 'Well, it doesn't matter. That was 30 years ago.' but he and I could be seated next to each other in the jury. Well, you were probably just a child when all of that happened years ago. I was 10 years old. I visited grandmother, who lived about 4 miles from Buchenwald. I smelled the odor. That was his story. All of that from reading the roll. A person could get interested in Paul's roll call here, if only to say, I wonder how Paul knew all of these people, since he's never been to that church. He knew over 30 people that are listed here that were a part of a church that he had never been to. I find that remarkable, don't you? Think of a church not that far away that you could name 30 people that attend. You would struggle, wouldn't you? But Paul knew 30 people at this church, or a few more. You could get interested in his roll call because it gives a picture of this membership of this church that Paul is writing to. I don't expect you to remember this, but in the list there's a husband and wife, Aquila and Priscilla. There's a man named Rufus and his mother. There's a brother, Nereus, and a sister. There are brothers Andronicus and Junius. There are sisters, Tryphena and Tryphosa. There's an old man, Epenetus. Isn't that an interesting profile of a church? There's a single woman, Mary, and a single man, Herodian. Wouldn't that be horrible? Are you going to church tonight? Are you going? Well, it's singles night tonight. But there's just the two of us. You think anybody would notice if I skipped? I think so. There's not a real traditional family mentioned here at all, except as God has called together and made a new family out of this church. It's an interesting list. Sort of. Not really, right? But for Paul, it's not a list. Don't call it a list. He's packing his things. You can picture it in your mind. He's in the home of Gaius, who hosts the church in Corinth. And he's there with Paul, and Paul is getting ready to go west. He wants to go to Italy. He wants to go to Spain, and he's about to move to this. He wants to go to this new parish, and it's far away, right? And now we think he was about 60 years old, give or take. And he thinks he's got one more ministry in him, right? Now that I do the job I do, I've discovered something. When you go to a church and they begin to build a profile of the pastor they want, you get a pastor who's my age, 59 or older. Those ages, that demographic isn't what churches list. They want a pastor who's 45. He's got 20 years of experience of pastoring, so the major blunders that you got to work out as a young pastor have kind of been beat out of him. He's got the wisdom to deal with conflict in the church. He's got a young family. He's going to be enthusiastic for the school. That's the pastor that they profile. They don't pastor, we're looking for a pastor that's, say 64, 65 years old. That's not what they pick. And I sit there and I think, you don't want me. I'm hurt, right? 60-year-old, and that's about where we think Paul was at this stage. And he's interesting because he's different than the pastors we think of today. Because the way we do it today, the church goes and hunt for the pastor. But that's not how Paul operated, is it? No, he got the church. He went and got them and formed the church. It wasn't the other way around. And that's different because in this day and age, we worry about an older pastor because we recognize if they're on the cusp of retirement, what that means is they've got one foot in the fire and one foot on a cruise ship. They want to go see, Alaska. Well, these churches had no choice because Paul picked his own. And so he thinks he's got one more in him. He had a late start in his career. We think he started when he was around 35, and so, he's got to work a little longer than the rest. At least in my imagination, that's how it was. He doesn't have much to pack. right? He's got to pack his coat and maybe a few books or scrolls and a few other things. And so while he's doing that, throwing things away and trimming down, loading up for her packing and moving, he comes across some notes and some letters. And he sits down amongst the boxes and he begins to remember all of the people that are in those notes, in those objects. Don't call this a list. You've done this yourself. Gail and I have lived in Michigan and Maryland and California and Oregon. When Gail and I are boxing our stuff up for a move, we run across something from one of our previous homes, previous lives, it feels like. Maybe you've experienced that. I ran across a book when we were packing the last time that I had gotten when I was a student chaplain in college. It made me think back to working at the hospital and the other people that worked in the chaplain's office with me. There was Joe, he was the head chaplain. He had a way of pausing in his speech that would make you just scream, wanting to help him finish a sentence, right? But a bigger heart I have never run across. He officiated at our wedding, and we loved him dearly. There was Foster Medford. That's not the city, Medford. That was his name, Foster Medford. I remember Foster because he had arthritis that bothered him. And every day, his wife took a can of WD-40 and sprayed the back of his hands and his back. And somehow it seemed to work. If only in his head it worked. A little bit of WD-40 seemed to work. He and Joe would chop firewood on their days off and give it away. They wanted to do something tangible because pastoring is a thing that happens all right up in here, right? It's a head job. It's not something where you can do something tangible and know you did something at the end of the day. And that was what they did. They chopped firewood on their days off, and then they would give it away as a ministry. And then they'd come back into the office on Monday morning, and here would come Foster carrying a can of WD-40. We humans are a funny lot, aren't we? Then there was Esther, our department secretary. I could go to her with any problem, and she seemed to have just the wisest of answers. She helped me plan how I was going to conduct my very first funeral as a young pastor. And it was for a Vietnamese Buddhist family. And I was panicked. How do you do that? How do I, as a Christian, conduct a funeral for a Vietnamese Buddha? And I just was beside myself, and I expressed it to her, and she said, Randy, they asked you to do it. Go share Christ with them. And it was like she flipped a switch off in my head, and I just went, and I was able to do that. And it turned out very well, and they were very responsive. That was Esther. There was Artie, our lady chaplain. She was a lady of very few words. I don't remember her saying hardly anything. All of those memories from me picking up a book and putting it in a box. Every time we move, we come across stuff and we stop and we remember. Don't call this a list. What Paul wrote here in Romans chapter 16, he'd tell you it wasn't a list. He was remembering people that were very special to him. You have Aquila and Priscilla. They risked their necks for me. Andronicus and Junius, we were in jail together. Man, they're great Christians. There's Mary. Mary, he says, worked hard. I can imagine Mary was the one. She was there when everybody else quit. The church service was over. Everybody had filed out, and Paul would be there, and he'd start cleaning up what was on the pews, the bulletins that got left behind, putting the hymnals back behind the pew. And she would say, now, Paul, you go on home. I'll put things up. I'll put the hymnals away. I'll pick up all the papers. I'll straighten the chairs. You go on home. You're tired. I can imagine Paul saying, well, you're tired too, Mary. Yes, Paul, but you got to ride a donkey across Asia tomorrow. You go on. I'll pick up here. Mary, he tells us, worked hard. Epenetus. Epenetus was the first person converted under my preaching. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I spent the whole night saying, thank God, finally somebody heard. The first one to respond to the gospel. The first person I ever gave Bible studies to, Paul could say. What a marvelous day that was. Tryphena and Tryphosa. They're twins. You can hear it in the name, can't you? Tryphena and Tryphosa. You know, their names mean delicate and dainty. They always sat right there on the right-hand side. One of them had a mole on her cheek, but I could never remember whether it was Tryphena or Tryphosa. I never did get them straight. And Rufus. Catch this. Tell Rufus hello. But it doesn't stop there. And tell his mother hello. Because she's my mom too. Doesn't that just blow your mind? Some lady earned from the Apostle Paul the title of mom, mother. He probably stayed in their home. Can you see her? In your imagination, what did she look like? In my imagination, she must have been a firecracker of a lady. She wore an apron and had a lot of pockets with things in it. She had really curly hair. She tried to tie it back, but it never cooperated, so some piece of hair was always sticking out at a weird angle. She could fix a breakfast for an army of farmers. Paul says, I'm sorry, I can't stay. I've got to go. I have to be on my way. I could hear her saying, you sit down and eat your breakfast, right? I don't care if you are an apostle. You got to eat your breakfast. Tell my mother hello. This is not a list. I remember when they built the famous list down on the mall. Block after polished block, forming a long wall of names. You have it here in town. You have something very similar. All of these names of the fallen. In D.C., it was the fallen in Vietnam. You've included others in yours. Some of us looked at that long list and like it was just a list of names. Others went over closer. They walked slowly down the column. There was a woman who went and put her finger up on a name. She held up a child and put the child's hand on a name. There was a young man who took a piece of paper and a pencil and took a rubbing of a name. There was another lady who kissed the wall at a name. There were flowers lying there, military medals lying beneath the wall. Don't call it a list. It's not a list. In fact, these names in Romans 16 are extremely special to Paul because even though he says, say hello to so-and-so, say hello to so-and-so, say hello to them, what he's really saying is goodbye. Goodbye. Oh, he's going to Rome, he says. But before he goes to Rome, he's going to go to Jerusalem. And he's going to go with an offering that he's collected. And he's going into this nest of hostility. So at the end of chapter 15, what he says is, he says to these people, please pray with me. Join me in my struggle. Pray with me that I won't be killed in Judea, that the saints will accept my offering in Jerusalem, and that I'll get to come and be back with you. Please pray. These are not just names. You've been handed a 3x5 card. I want you to get it out just now, if you would. And I want you to take a pen or a pencil, and I want you to write this across the top of the card. I thank God for all my remembrances of you. I thank God for all my remembrances of you. I thank God for all my remembrances of you. And then write a name. You choose the name. You think of the people that have had an impact in your life, that have brought you spiritually to where you are today, and write the name. And then write another, and another, and another. And while you're doing that, I'd like to paint a picture in the imagination of your mind. Many years ago, a young pastor received his first assignment. He was assigned a little tiny church in the backwoods in the Appalachian Mountains. It was the custom in that church at Easter time to have a baptismal service. It was held at a lake at sundown Easter evening. Out on a sandbar in the lake, the young pastor stood with the candidates for the baptism. And after they were immersed, the candidates moved out of the water and then went to the shore and changed their clothes in little booths that had been constructed of hanging blankets. Then they went to the fire out on the sandbar that was in the center, and all of the people would gather around them. Last of all, the preacher changed his clothes and he went to the fire. There, the congregation had cooked a little supper and they sang songs together. Once they were all around the fire, one of the men of the church introduced the new people. He gave their names, where they lived, and where they worked. Then the rest of the group formed a circle around them while they stayed warm at the fire. And the next part of their little church ritual was that each person around the circle would give his or her name. And then they said this: "Hi, my name is, and if you ever need somebody to do the washing or ironing, you can call on me. Hi, my name is, and if you ever need anybody to chop wood, you can call on me. My name is, and if you ever need anybody to babysit, you could call me. My name is, and if you ever need anybody to repair your house, call me. My name is, and if you ever need anybody to sit with the sick, you can call on me. My name is, and if you ever need a car to go into town, you can call me. My name is, and if you ever need anybody to watch your kids or tutor your kids, you can call me." And around the circle they went. Then they ate, and somebody brought out a fiddle, and they sang happy songs. Finally, at the appointed time, the elder, with his thumbs and his bib overalls, would stand up and he would say, "Okay, it's time to go." And everybody would leave. And after everybody had left, the elder would take the toe of his big old shoe and he would kick sand over the dying fire. After the young preacher experienced this for the first time, the elder saw him standing there still, staring at now a dying and dead fire. The elder came up, looked at him, and said, "You mark my words. Folks don't ever get any closer than this." In that little community, they have a name for that. In that community, their name for that is church. They call that church. Have you written any names? Do you have a name or two written down? How many, I wonder, are your fellow church members in this room, maybe even today? Have you written any names? I want to urge you, with your imagination, keep this list. Keep it, because to you it's not a list. In fact, the next time you move and you're casting off things that you don't want anymore, oh no, I'm not going to pack that in a box. I want to urge you to take the list with you. You can get rid of electronics, you can get rid of books, you could get rid of furniture. Hang on to the list, because for you, this is not a list. These are important people to you. And in fact, when your ministry has ended and you rest from your work here on earth, I want to encourage you to tell them to stick this list in there with you. Because the day will come when you will shake the dust off of your resting place. And before you leap into the air, I want to encourage you to reach back and grab that list and grab that piece of paper. I know, in our imaginations, if eventually you'll get there and you have to wait through some kind of a long line at a gate, right? And some angel is going to say, "Now look, you went into the world with nothing and you're going to come out of the world with nothing. What is it that you've got there that you're holding on to?" And you'll say, well, it's just some names. Well, let me see it. It's just a list of some names of people I struggled with and worshiped with, and sometimes I even fought with. It's just people who helped me. Well, let me see it. Oh, it's just a group of people that if it weren't for them, I don't know what would have happened in my life. I want to see it. Finally, you give it to him in my imagination, and he smiles. He goes, oh, I know all of them. In fact, I overheard them as they were coming through the gate. They were going to go and they were going to paint this big, giant sign, and they were going to hang it right over there over the street, and it was going to say, Welcome Home Church. Ellen White in Acts of the Apostles says, the members of Christ's church are not to be dependent upon man or human institutions. Christ is their living head, and they are to depend on him. They are to be united in the closest bonds of Christian fellowship, encouraging and strengthening one another in the service of their master. The verse we read as the elder's verse, Colossians chapter 3, says that we should bear with each other and forgive one another. If any of you has some grievance against someone, or you've had some kind of dispute, forgive as the Lord forgave you. That's a big forgiveness, right? And over all of the virtues, put on love, which binds us all together as a church family in perfect unity. So the challenge before us, the challenge I find here in Romans chapter 16 and in Colossians 3, is for me to be that kind of person, right? For me to be someone that others would stop and think and write down on their list. I, like all of us, have a tendency to just fall into friendships. Maybe you do too. Romans 16 challenges us to be intentional in seeking out new friends, going the extra mile to show somebody the love of Christ and to form a friendship with them. Romans 16 reminds me that doing life with people is what creates the bonds that are going to last into eternity. Teaching and providing information, while valuable, doesn't create the bonds that carry forward in life. Romans chapter 16 says, I dare you to be that kind of friend that somebody would write down on their piece of paper. So this afternoon, you have an opportunity to interact with our community, our church, bigger than just this local church. And I want to invite you to come. And that's it. That's our time together. We have a closing hymn, and then I'll close with benediction.
We invite you to stand for the closing hymn. Page 432, Shall We Gather at the River? Won't that be a day?
Amen.
Shall we gather at the river where bright angels' feet have trod? Walk and standings at the river that flows by the throne of God. Soon we'll reach the shining river. Soon our pilgrimage will cease. Soon our happy hearts will quiver with the melody of peace. Yes, we'll gather at the river, the beautiful river. Gather with the saints at the river that flows by the throne of grace.
Romans chapter 16 ends with these words, and they will serve as our benediction. Now to him who is able to establish you in accordance with my gospel, the message I proclaim about Jesus Christ, to the only wise God, be glory forever through Jesus Christ. Amen.